This is the Comics Alternative Interviews, a conversation with Katrina Chapman. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews. I'm Derek, and on this episode, I have the pleasure of talking with Katrina Chapman. Her new book, Follow Me In, was released last month from Avery Hill Publishing. But before we get to that conversation, I want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Interviews is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off at the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off at the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off at the cover price. Sometimes 50% off cover. But every now and again, you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that. And one of the best ways of saving in Discount Comic Book Service is by getting your comics bundled. You can find wonderful bundles for 50% off the cover price from such publishers as Marvel, DC, and Valiant. And even though we're at the end of November, that's okay, because at Discount Comic Book Service, they're okay with late orders. They're great all the way around. You really can't beat the prices and the service at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com. They will take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your titles there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you. I first met Katrina Chapman through her work at Avery Hill Publishing. She works in marketing there, and back in summer of 2015, she introduced me to Tilly Walden. Tilly's first book, The End of Summer, had just been released, and Kat worked with me on setting up an interview with this very young artist. But over the subsequent years, I've come to know Kat more as an artist herself. She had done a lot of illustration work for children's books, but it was her self-published comic Catzine that specifically caught my attention. In fact, we had discussed Catzine in a special episode from last year where we looked at self-published comics. In one of the later issues of Catzine, she mentions working on her first book, an autobiographical work centered on her travels in Mexico. Last month, that book, Follow Me In, was released by Avery Hill. This is a fascinating travelogue about her experiences touring Mexico, its diverse regions, its many ruins, and its vibrant cultures. As you'll hear in this interview, Kat doesn't only write about her experiences touring in her new book, but she also explores her problematic relationship with her companion as well as her own efforts as an artist. As such, Follow Me In is much more than a travelogue. It's an account of a young artist undergoing new experiences and using those to grow as a creator and to define her art. I had a wonderful time talking with Kat, and let's listen to that conversation now. I'm really happy to have on the Comics Alternative again, Katrina Chapman. Her new book, Follow Me In, came out through Avery Hill last month. Katrina, welcome back to the Comics Alternative.
Thank you for having me, Derek.
And I say welcome back because if you recall, in May of 2016, we did a publisher spotlight on Avery Hill. And one of the things, I think Gwen and I did that show, one of the things that we did for that publisher spotlight is to talk with you and I think one or two other people at Avery Hill about that season's releases.
Yeah, I remember it because we were in Toronto for TCAF. So we were sitting in a hotel room talking to you on Skype.
That's right. Yeah. Because you were sitting around in a hotel room, I guess on a speakerphone or something like that. It sounded a little distant, but now you're much more clear.
Oh, good.
Mm-hmm.
Brilliant.
Yes. So let's start with I guess, an introduction of your new book. I mean, this is your first book. I mean, you're not new to comics, but this is your first, I guess, full-length narrative. Follow Me In. If you were going to describe this to the uninitiated, how would you do so?
It's right. It's kind of basically it's just a travelogue, but it has a lot of extra elements thrown in because I was quite keen to make it a book that had a sort of readability factor where you would want to keep turning the page and it wouldn't be dry. So I decided to add into the travelogue element a sort of thread running through of a personal story. It's about a 9-month period I spent traveling when I was about 25 with a partner who had an alcohol problem. And I decided that the personal part of that story would make an interesting kind of through line and a human element to the story. So while I could talk about the places that I saw that I was really keen to write about, to draw and to talk about, that there would be a kind of interesting storyline unfolding at the same time that would keep people interested. And it also has a third kind of aspect, which are these little pages that break up the narrative where I talk about aspects of Mexico's history and culture and things like that. And they're more sort of factual little bits that break up the main story. So I guess, yeah, that's how I'd describe it, a travelogue, but with some extra elements thrown in.
Yeah. I think a travelogue is a really good way to describe it. And that, in many ways, I think is kind of a subset to autobiographical comics, right?
Yeah.
And, you know, given what you do in Follow Me In, and also your zine, Cat Zine, which we actually, if you recall, we reviewed on the Comics Alternative last year, I think in June of last year. You do seem to have a more autobiographical bent to your comics. And I'm wondering if that's an area that you just feel more comfortable with, or do you have plans or interests in, let's say, more fictional narrative, something in addition to, let's say, memoir or autobiography?
Yes, definitely. That's a good question because I'm at a point now where I'm wanting to kind of get out of my comfort zone, which is definitely autobio stuff. And I've just this week started working on a new idea for a fiction book. So that's really exciting and very scary. But I do feel like autobio is my comfort zone. And it's when I was thinking of content for my zine, which I did 8 issues of, it was always stuff that sprung to mind was kind of like, oh, I should talk about that thing that happened to me, or it would be interesting to talk about this thing. And it was very easy for me to kind of sit down and make those into little short comics. But I have wanted to do something that's fiction. So yeah, I'm trying to take that step now. And I'm working on a little idea that I had actually before I even started working on Follow Me In. But when I was thinking about it a few years ago, I didn't really know how to do it. I had an idea for some characters and things, but I think the experience of doing this longer book has given me the confidence to try that now, which is great. But yeah, it's definitely out of my comfort zone.
You know, if I remember correctly, I think it was maybe in issue number 7 of Cat Zine, you referenced your work on a new book, which eventually became Follow Me In. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm curious about, I mean, not so much the mentioning of one in the other, but I guess your work in general on Cat Zine and then the new book, Follow Me In. How did your work on Cat Zine inform what you did eventually with your first book, Follow Me In?
I think it was quite crucial, really, because I before I started the zine, I hadn't done an awful lot of comics at all. I had been self-publishing for a few years, but I'd been doing little illustrated books and sort of not really narrative stuff, not really sequential stuff. Well, maybe they were more like kind of art books in a way. They were kind of illustrated short stories and things, but not with panels. And I've always wanted to do comics, but being from an illustration background, I couldn't quite understand how comic creators manage to do the work because it's such a labor intensive kind of art form.
Mm-hmm.
And I was used to being able to do a book cover or something, which wouldn't take me very long, but I couldn't see how you could do a 250 page graphic novel with however many panels on every page. It just seemed like a crazy amount of work. But when I first started discussing ideas with Avery Hill, this was before I even started working with them, because I work as a marketing person with my publisher as well. Ricky, who's my sort of boss and who edited this book for me, he suggested that before trying to sit down and do a long graphic novel, it might be an idea to do some practice at comics work. So that's why I started the zine. It was another idea that I'd wanted to do for a while, and it just gave me an opportunity to practice writing comics and drawing comics and try out different formats and try and work out a kind of what style I would want to finally do the book in. And so over the course of a couple of years, I did 8 issues and just, I think it was actually over 3 years, while starting to write the book, I put out these short zines, and it helped me kind of work out my system and how I was going to do it. So it was really crucial part of the process, I think.
Yeah, because, I mean, obviously, like Follow Me In, Catzine is your own. And, you know, you'd mentioned your earlier illustration work. Yeah, I haven't seen these, but I've noticed that you've done quite a number of books that others have written, like Miracle in Bethlehem, Joe and Jess Go to the Dentist, This Is Me, Little Devil, where you were the illustrator, but not the writer. But Catzine gave you, I guess, the experience and, so to speak, the chops to actually test your mettle when it comes to writing comics completely, being the writer and the artist.
Yeah, absolutely. I did work in children's books for maybe about 6 years, but it's very different trying to write a story of your own, especially a long book like Follow Me In. Yeah, I felt like I needed to do some serious kind of writing practice before I could tackle that. Mm-hmm. But well, yes, I mean, having your own zine is a great way to kind of have the freedom to experiment and try different things and see what works for you.
So you were working on Follow Me In while you were putting out at least some of the later issues of Catzine.
Yes, yeah.
How long did it take you total to complete Follow Me In, this being your first book?
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask this. I'm one of those people that is terrible with dates and times and things, and I honestly can't really remember. A good few years mm-hmm. because I did work on it alongside other things, and I always take on other little jobs here and there, so I would always have to stop and start and do little short projects and commissions and things. But I mean, I know I wrote it out as a complete script, got Ricky to kind of work on that and edit that with me, and then started drawing it, which did take a long time, probably a year or so. And I drew the whole thing out in rough and then drew it all out again in the final art and colored it. But by the end, I was working on that completely full time, apart from my, I have 2 part-time jobs that I do as well to pay my rent. So, yeah, the last few months were quite intensive. I colored it in about 3 months, I think. Just kind of solidly working through and not doing any zines or anything.
You know, you also mentioned your work in marketing at Avery Hill, which is actually where I first met you, right? I think we first made contact maybe about 3 years ago. This is around the time that Tilly Walden's first book came out, and you alerted me to this. And so that's how we got connected, and we've been corresponding ever since. So I consider you a true friend of the podcast, and you've been so helpful. Right. But I'm curious how your work at Avery Hill may, or even maybe may not, inform your work as a cartoonist.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I'm not sure. I certainly, it's helpful in many ways. I get to read an awful lot of great comics that I maybe wouldn't otherwise. Not only Avery Hill's work, but also we partner with Retrofit in America, and we distribute each other's work and stuff. So that's given me access to a lot of their books. And I think, what you read informs your own work often. But also, I mean, it's really useful because I do marketing and publicity and stuff. That's given me a lot of contact with people like yourself that review comic books and talk about comic books, which is always helpful for someone that makes them. But it's almost, I was talking to some people last night, actually. We had a little comic creator get together last night, and we were saying how it's so much easier to sell or market someone else's work rather than your own. It just feels more comfortable to rave about a book that's not yours, that's by someone else. And so I really enjoy that with my work with Avery Hill, that I can talk about other people's work and say, you know, this book is amazing. You really need to read this. So I really enjoy doing that for Avery Hill's creators, just trying to get them seen. Because, I mean, we're still a fairly small publisher in the UK, and we're always trying to branch out into, you know, America, North America, getting people to notice our books. Because, yeah, we do produce some really nice stuff.
Do you find that over the past several years, there has been more attention paid to Avery Hill? In other words, that you're getting the word out?
Yes.
To North America and otherwise?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and we've got another person that's joined the team that's helping us do more of that, because I work very part-time hours with them. There's a limit to what I can achieve in the time I have. So, yeah, but it's always great when something like Comics Alternative takes an interest, because that is really helpful getting the word out in America.
Yeah. We really do love the books that you put out. And, you know, not only did we do that publisher spotlight, but we've reviewed a number of your other texts here and there as they've come out, and even interviewed some of your creators.
Yeah, Tim Bird. I don't know if he was your last one. I think so.
Yeah, that was the last Avery Hill creator that I had on the show. You know, I want to talk more about the specifics of this new book, Follow Me In. One of the things that struck me, Kat, about the narrative is the way that you chose to structure it, especially in terms of time. I think the book, for the most part, or at least the core of the narrative, is in chronological order. I mean, yeah, and there are flashbacks at times. But the way that you begin and almost end the book is, well, there's an outer narrative frame where, I guess more recently, you meet up with your former companion, Richard, and then you recall your time traveling several years earlier in Mexico, and then that becomes the main story. But even that story begins a little out of chronological sync, in that you start off with, I think, a scene where Richard is drunk and you don't know where he is, and it's the Day of the Dead. And then after that scene, we get to, I guess, close to the beginning of your story, your trip to Mexico. And I'm wondering about the thoughts that went into the temporal structuring of Follow Me In.
Yeah, well, when I started the writing process, Ricky from Avery Hill suggested that I think about, would it be interesting to do some stuff out of chronological order and play with the timeline a bit? And immediately I did think it would be quite good to start it at the most dramatic point, which was the real crisis point, was that Day of the Dead incident. And I thought it would be interesting to drop the reader into that, and then go back to the start of the trip, so that the reader would kind of be interested to know how we got to that point and what was the background of that. And the introduction bit with the two of us meeting up years later, that came about because I was saying to Ricky, I'd love to touch on the fact that a lot has changed in Mexico since I was there. I was there in 2003 and 2004. And a lot of the stuff that you read in the newspapers these days about Mexico was quite different back then. And I wanted to be able to address that. And I kind of had the idea of, I said, well, writing a kind of little foreword or something might be a bit boring. So I could make it part of the comic by having that little scene where we discuss some of those things. And we also touch on the fact that back then we had no smartphones and things with us. So that made traveling itself quite a different experience and a little bit more challenging than it is today. And it also gave me a chance to address the fact that I was writing about a real person, and that there are issues with that when you put a real person into your story and put it out into the world. And the fact that I did want to tell him before I started that I was going to do it and see what he thought. And luckily for me, him being a writer, he was very understanding. But I also wanted to touch on that as well. And doing that kind of little intro bit gave me a chance to talk about some of that stuff outside of the main narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it helps to set a context.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I'm curious, in terms of taking your trip, which you write about in this new book, why Mexico? Or another way of asking this is, or an additional way of asking that question is, what does Mexico mean to you?
Yeah,
what did Mexico mean to you?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think I touch on it a tiny bit in the book. It was really Richard, who was my partner at the time, who's the other main character of the book. It was his interest that he had always wanted to visit, and he'd done a bit of anthropology studies, and he was interested in the indigenous communities there. And it was just somewhere he'd always wanted to go. And he was a big traveler. He would travel kind of all over the place very spontaneously. He was very adventurous. So really it was me kind of tagging along a little bit. And I think I say at one point in the book, I didn't know really anything about Mexico before I started researching it in preparation for the trip. I had never met anyone that was from there. And I really didn't, it was all new to me when I started to read about the place we were kind of working towards visiting. So it was really interesting to me to go somewhere where I had no previous knowledge, and really exciting. And I hope it comes across in the book that the huge impact it had on both of us. I think I've been back several times since. My partner now is Mexican, and I go there every so often still. So it's still a big part of my life. I wanted to kind of try and show that a trip like that can be a real life-changing experience in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense in reading Follow Me In that it was life-changing in a variety of different ways, and not just the trip itself, right? Not just seeing Mexico, because there are other things that happened there that I want to talk to you about in a few minutes. I didn't get a sense. You describe yourself as kind of tagging along with Richard. I don't know. In reading the book, I didn't get the sense that you were someone who was passively tagging along. I mean, you seem much more of an active participant in this trip. And in fact, there are times that you take control when things seem to get a little out of hand, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, more in the sense of the idea of it all came from him. I just agreed that it would be a great thing to do. Yeah, it's more just the whole concept of the trip was his to begin with. But yeah, once we were there, definitely I was an active part of the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say you've been back to Mexico several times since, but during this trip that you chronicle and Follow Me In, was there a particular, I guess, region of Mexico, location that really stood out to you, that you consider a highlight, or at least one of the highlights of that journey?
I think for me, definitely the South and the state of Chiapas and the Yucatan. I absolutely fell in love with the jungle, with that kind of environment. And I think I write in the second half of the book, there's a lot with that kind of jungle setting, which is so fun to draw as well. I was really looking forward to drawing that. But yeah, I fell in love with the Mayan ruins, the archaeological sites, the ancient Mayan artwork I became completely obsessed with. So traveling through Chiapas, where there was a lot of archaeology to see, and also with that kind of jungle setting, was just really, really incredible to see. Yeah, that was probably my favorite thing.
Yeah, that part of the narrative where you guys were in the southern part, the more jungle area, I think was really vibrant. And I particularly like, what are they, howler monkeys?
Yes, yeah.
and I've never heard one. I mean, do they howl?
They roar like it almost sounds like a big cat kind of sound.
Really?
It's quite terrifying. Yeah. That terrifying volume of noise to come from quite a small animal.
Monkeys.
Yeah. No, and also the wildlife, definitely, like you say. I love monkeys. I love all kinds of wildlife. So to go somewhere where they were just all around you, there were actually, the trip that we actually went on continued south as far as Panama. We went all the way through Central America, but Ricky and I decided that it would be kind of a nice round story to just do the Mexico part and to have the story end there. Early on, I was considering doing like a second part to the book, but he said, I don't know, we just agreed that it might be nice to just kind of end it where it ended, with crossing the border and that kind of rounding off the story a little bit, even though it's quite an open-ended ending.
Well, would you consider writing a follow-up to Follow Me In?
I don't think I can. I mean, I think it would be great to talk about some of the other experiences I had in other countries in Central America, like I did do in Katrina a little bit. There were stories that were about Guatemala, hiking in the jungle there. Mm-hmm. But I'm not sure. I like the fact that the story kind of ends the way it does. I'm not sure if I would want to then just reopen it again. Mm-hmm. It's hard when you write autobio to kind of feel like have a satisfying conclusion to the story, because life doesn't sort of just round up neatly. And so I kind of like the way that this story ended, and I'm not sure how I would tackle doing another installment of the same thing again. So yeah, I'll probably write about it, but in other ways.
You know, you mentioned a while ago that one of the things that really stood out to you on this trip were the various ruins, the Mayan ruins that you guys saw. And I definitely got that from the book, in that whenever the two of you came across ruins, I mean, both of you were quite moved. You were moved, though, in a different way, because it allowed you the opportunity to bring in your art. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what these various ruins meant to you, what kind of, let's say, emotional or even artistic effect they had on you.
Yeah, that also became a little through line to the book, was me rediscovering drawing, because prior to the trip I'd had a long period where I'd just given up on it, and I didn't really know. I'd always done art like all the way through school and stuff, and it was always one of my kind of best subjects at school, and I always did very well at it, but I had no idea how you could use that in a sensible like career sense. So I had a long period where I just didn't do anything, and this trip was really the point where I got back into it and thought, no, I do love this, and I do need to kind of use this skill somehow. But you're right. I did have a very kind of profound reaction to the Mayan art that I saw, and I don't know what it is really. I just loved it. I just loved the aesthetics of it. And I've always had a weird thing where I'm not especially into art, like fine art particularly, and I don't even look at a lot of illustration and stuff, but I do like kind of I do like ancient art. There's just something about it that grabs me, so I don't know. But it was just so much fun to draw, and I don't know if I mentioned this in the book. I think I touch on it at one point. It kind of helps you to understand, because a lot of ancient Mayan art is very complex, and there's a lot of lines and a lot of detail, and when you first look at it you kind of think, what is this depicting? I don't understand it. But when you draw it, it kind of helps you to actually understand what you're seeing, and you're kind of like, oh, of course, this is, you know, this person's shoe, and this is this person's headdress, and this is an earring. So I found that I was really involved with it through copying it and drawing it. I found that a really fun, kind of rewarding process.
Yeah, and you mentioned that your art is kind of a thread that's woven throughout. And one of the things that I noticed is, you know, a lot of this book is about you and your relationship to art or to illustration, or you as an artist. Because when we start off and we first see you drawing, you comment on the fact that you're rusty and you don't feel really comfortable with it, that it's been a long time since you've actually put pen to paper. But then as the narrative progresses and as your journey progresses through Mexico, you comment as a character on the fact that it becomes much easier, you become much more adept, and then sprinkled throughout Follow Me In are various illustrations, I'm assuming, that you made while you were on the trip. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah, that's right. They're just actual sketchbook pages, which I always like the idea of including those, because I thought it would be kind of interesting for the reader to be able to see what I was actually drawing at the time. I filled one kind of big sketchbook throughout that trip, and I actually made a little video of it that's on YouTube. So if anyone's interested, you can see that. I think if you just search for my name on YouTube, it'll pop up. But it's because you only see a handful of my sketchbook pages in this book, but there's obviously a lot more. So yeah, that's a little extra thing that people can look at if they're interested. But yeah, I definitely found that, because I'm not the sort of artist that doodles a lot and does kind of imaginative, crazy stuff. I like to draw from life, and I really enjoy like drawing what's in front of me. And certainly if you go somewhere that's completely different to what you know, that can really help inspire you to get drawing. If you're looking at things going, I've never seen anything like this, it just really inspired me to kind of get back into it and to just kind of make a visual record of things that I was seeing.
Yeah. And, this through line of you as an artist becoming, I guess, closer to your art through this trip struck me as rather self-reflexive. And it becomes, to some degree, you could argue that Follow Me In is somewhat like a portrait of the artist, right? Not to necessarily compare you to James Joyce, but what you're doing is you're showing us an individual who is coming into her own, or it's at least is becoming much more comfortable with her abilities as an artist. Yeah,
and I have this conversation with friends who draw and are in art quite often, that there's an idea with people who don't do creative work that it just kind of flows out of you, and it's just like this kind of crazy intuitive natural thing that you can't help yourself from doing. And I think I said at one point in the book, like, I really struggle to sit down and do this sometimes. Like, I don't want to, and I don't feel like it. And I wanted to kind of try and capture some of the real side of that for me, which is like, it's a little bit like work sometimes, and it's not something that I spontaneously have to do, but it does help an awful lot if you're really inspired by a particular thing. So yeah, that's definitely one thing that I got out of this whole experience.
Now, did you find yourself struggling more with Follow Me In than you had, let's say, with your work on Catscene, or were they equal in struggle?
Well, the length of it was difficult. It's 248 pages, and just to kind of get your head around every aspect of that is quite a challenge. My zines are only 24 pages long. And so I hadn't done anything like this length before. And just because there's so much tiny granular detail that you're looking at, like you're kind of thinking, is this person's arm right in this one panel on one page of 248 pages? So you're really tightly focused on little small things. And at the same time, you're trying to keep an overview of the whole story in your head and thinking, how is this working? And that's where I think it was really helpful to have a good editor. Ricky from Avery Hill was brilliant, and we would have occasional meetings where we would sit down. Like, I printed out at one point every page, and we spread them all out on the floor and just kind of did some editing that way. And it was helpful to have a second pair of eyes to kind of help me with the overview part when I was kind of bogged down in details. That was the hardest part for me, I think, was trying to, even when I'd put all the pages together and it was all kind of done, there were still points in the narrative where I was like, well, does that bit come before that other bit? I can't even remember where some of the little flashbacks that you referred to earlier, I would kind of think, where does that bit actually happen? So it was that thing of trying to keep an overview of the whole thing while as the writer and the artist, you're kind of in charge of everything. So it's a lot to kind of deal with.
Well, in constructing Follow Me In, did you keep some kind of, chart, something on the wall where you could make notes about like what happened when and when you would include this in the book and so on and so forth?
I just had a Word document really where I had a little summary of each section and each page, and I just referred to that. So, yeah, but I don't like working on things in order. I like to kind of jump around a bit. Like I like to kind of draw a section from the middle and then a section from the start, and that probably didn't help with my attempts to keep it all under control in my head. I just always feel like starting from the beginning and just working through is A, a little bit boring, and also B, I feel like I'm still finding my feet with the style and the characters early on. And so to start at the beginning, you risk it then changing, the consistency of the characters and things. I feel like if you jump around a bit, it helps with that fact that things might change slightly as you go through the whole 240 pages. So yeah, but that, I don't know. Some people I know do like to start with page one and just work through in an organized fashion. I like jumping around and just kind of deciding what bit to focus on today is kind of quite fun. It keeps you interested when it's several years worth of work, I think.
Well, you mentioned the jumping around. I'm curious now, when you started Follow Me In, where did you start?
Well, I did have a full written script that I'd done to begin with. And obviously it did change a little bit as we worked on it. But I wanted to get the story written in a state that was as good as it could be before I started drawing, because I didn't want to draw big sections of it and then cut them later, or I didn't want to waste too much time drawing. So I made a point of writing it all out first, and working on it with Ricky to get it into shape before I did any actual drawing work. So I always had that as a sort of guide. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the initial script and there being some changes. Were they significant changes, or what kind of changes did you make along the way?
I wouldn't say really huge changes. It was more just kind of, Ricky was very good at looking at how long, how many pages were devoted to each kind of location or section, and saying this section is a bit long. And he would just give me notes like, try and cut 4 pages out of this bit, try and cut 2 pages out of this bit. We also wanted to keep it a manageable length, where it was actually going to be manageable for me to make it in time. So I wanted to put a lot into it. But I also wanted to keep it as tight as possible. So he was very good at telling me where I should cut stuff out. It was more things along those lines, really. Just like, do we need 8 pages for this one section, or could it be shorter? And it was, condensing certain bits. And there were also a few bits that he wanted me to expand. The bit with the howler monkeys, I initially did that it was very brief, and he said he wanted a couple more pages on the monkeys.
Because you can't have too many monkeys in a narrative.
No. Yeah, that was feedback that was good for me to hear. Like, I want more monkeys.
And don't we all?
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that struck me, we've been talking about the through line of Follow Me In, or one of the through lines is your work and your growth as an artist and your relationship with your art. Another through line in the story, and you've touched upon this, I think, at the beginning of our conversation, is your relationship, or your problematic relationship with your companion at the time, Richard. Because this becomes a very important part of the story, especially as the narrative develops. I mean, when I read Follow Me In, I didn't know how serious, like when we get that first scene, at the Day of the Dead, and you're waiting for him and you don't know where he is and you think he may be lost, and then he shows up drunk. I didn't get a sense that he had a drinking problem, or it would be as serious as it becomes later in the book. But that does become a big problem for you. And I'm wondering if you could speak to your attempts to work in your relationship with Richard into this narrative, because as bright and hopeful in many ways as your journey was in Mexico, this is the potentially darker underside of that trip. Yeah,
definitely. Yeah, and I obviously did have to think hard about, how much to talk about or how much to include and whether it was okay to talk about. But I thought it would just provide a really interesting side to the story that would kind of give the reader a reason to kind of keep reading, to think, how's this going to pan out? And it's just, at that age, I was 24, and it's quite hard to know how to deal with a situation like that. You don't know whether you're doing the wrong thing or the right thing. So yeah, I just wanted to show my character kind of dealing with that, those things at the same time as having these wonderful experiences, that there's always a lot more going on, with people and with relationships and things. But it was definitely a little strange to revisit that and to draw it. And yeah, I didn't want to put too much of it in as well. I mean, there was way more drinking on the course of the trip than actually appears in the book. But I thought it would have more impact to just show key moments, I think. And yeah, definitely the nature of the drinking was very much like binging and not an everyday drinking situation. And I wanted to capture that, because I think that was, for a long time, was part of my problem of really understanding what the issue was, because I thought he can't be an alcoholic if he doesn't drink every day, because alcoholics are people that are, can't function at all. So it took me a long time, and I kind of bring all of this into the book a little bit to really understand that he did have this problem and that it wasn't going to go away, and to try and decide how I was going to deal with it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that struck me in the book is that, the cat at the time when you were 24, you were concerned about it, but at the same time, you're kind of tentative about how to react to it. Because there are occasions where, him knowing that he has a drinking problem and you know that he has a drinking problem, that you, like, for instance, when you guys stop off at, where is it? Is it when he drinks mezcal? What?
The town of Tequila.
Tequila. Okay, Tequila. Yeah, not mezcal. Tequila. Yeah, you stop off at Tequila. And of course, he has to try, you both have to try various kinds of tequila. And every now and again, he'll say just one, or let me do this one time. And you tend to have a concern, but it is, I guess, a kind of a concern that where you hang back and you let him do it and you don't say anything, but you're nonetheless wary.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I definitely wasn't the most kind of assertive, forceful personality, really. And I didn't like saying, no, absolutely not to him or to anyone at that age. But yeah, it casts a shadow over everything you do, because if there's a threat of alcohol, if there's something like New Year's Eve coming up or something, you're kind of immediately worried about what that's going to entail. So I just wanted that sense of a constant looming threat of, you can never quite relax and you never know when the next thing is going to happen where it's all going to go bad again. I just wanted that sense of how it affects, even when, nothing's going on, you're still concerned about when it's going to go off the rails again.
Right. And I think that works really well in the story. That sense of potential foreboding.
Yeah, definitely.
Another thing that you do in this book, and again, you've referenced this earlier, is that you sprinkle throughout your narrative information pages. And sometimes this is just one page. Sometimes it's a 2-page spread. Sometimes these information pages, I guess more times than not, they're about the locations that you guys actually visit, where you give us a little history, where and these are sections where there's quite a bit of art and illustration, but there's also much more text than we get in the comics proper, let's say. So we get information about the locations, the ruins, but you also have these information pages about things like how you prepared for the trip, what you're carrying around in your backpacks, and things of that sort. And I'm wondering about your decision to include those information pages. I mean, I think they work really well with the story, and they add to the narrative of your travels. But what all went into the decision to include those in the book?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, there's different types of little kind of fact pages. There are ones that are about certain locations, and it kind of all developed a little bit as we were going with writing this, where I was kind of like, do I do an introduction to each location, or at what point do I show a map maybe to show whereabouts in the country we are? And it kind of also came out of when I first started to try and, before I was working on this with Avery Hill, I had a few stabs at trying to write this comic, where I'd gone through my journals from the time and just tried to start putting it into comic form, everything that happened. And I realized that I couldn't put everything that happened down, because it would just be the longest book in the world. So some of those pages came out of trying to condense stuff that I kind of thought, I want to include some of these facts, but I don't want to have to do them as part of the comics narrative because it'll take too long. So yeah, I kind of ended up doing a little kind of location introduction periodically to show where we were and what was different about that part of the country from the previous part, and some background and history and things like that. But some of the other ones I just thought would be kind of fun and nerdy and just like the what we're carrying and things. It's just stuff that I wonder about. I think when I read about people doing things like this, I think, well, what do you actually take with you and how does it all work? And I just thought it would be kind of fun, and it would provide a little pause in the narrative to kind of do these things. But yeah, a part of our editing work was deciding what of that to keep and what to not include. There was quite a bit that got cut. because I love Mexico so much, I could have gone on and on about these aspects. And I thought, we just tried to keep a balance. That was part of my worry overall, was how to balance all the different elements that I was trying to include, and keep it working well and not have too much of one thing or the other.
It's interesting that you describe these information pages, at least some of them, as ways of writing about events or phenomena that you don't include in the story proper, but it allows you to include some information about your trip nonetheless. I mean, one of those that really stood out to me as a great example is the section, I guess this is in the last third of the book, definitely the last half, where you guys go to San Cristobal de la Casa, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. And there's really nothing in the comic about the Zapatistas, but you give us a 2-page spread. I think it's a 2-page spread where you tell us about who the Zapatistas are and the history of the Zapatistas that has really nothing to do with your and Richard's journey. But I think it's useful nonetheless because, I mean, this is the region where they reside, and there's a rich history, a really interesting history behind the Zapatistas.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was fascinating as I was traveling to discover that there were areas, certain towns and villages and little areas of Chiapas that consider themselves autonomous, and they don't, they don't abide by the laws of the country. They're kind of little areas that are laws unto themselves, and that's fascinating to me. And also, I mean, I do show in some of the little comic sections as we get into that area that you start to see signs around on the road saying you're entering Zapatista territory. And so I kind of thought that would tie in a little bit. That would give me a way of introducing it into the comic part, and then explaining what that actually means. But yeah, that's a really interesting part of Mexico's history, and I wanted to include something on that.
Yeah.
It would be hard to kind of work all this detail, I think, into the actual sequential part of the storytelling.
Yeah. And in fact, when you guys are on the bus entering Chiapas, you look out the window and you do see a sign that I guess say that this is Zapatista territory. But that's the only reference we get to the Zapatistas in the comic proper. And then you give us the information pages. So I think that's a really nice supplement.
Yeah. There's just so much. It's such a fascinating place.
Mm-hmm. Now, you said a moment ago that there was no way that you could include everything that you guys experienced, everything that you saw, every place that you went in this book because, you had to limit the page count to some degree. I wonder if you can speak a little bit about some of those events or scenes or locations that you had considered including in the book and you had wanted to, but you nonetheless had to pull, or at least you couldn't really spend the time really covering.
Yeah, I mean, we were there for 6 months in Mexico itself, which is a long time. And so I definitely realized that at a certain point I was going to have to pick and choose what were the most interesting parts. And it was quite obvious what they were going to be, with things like the Copper Canyons in the north of Mexico, where we ended up staying in a cabin with no water or power, and things like that were kind of obvious choices of where I would expand, that into a little section. But there were other places that were really interesting, and I still kind of thought, I don't know if I can justify this having a whole section to itself. So what I ended up doing was, there were just so many, and what I would end up doing was putting that into a little summary at the start of each new kind of part of the country that we traveled to, where I would show a map and maybe just do a little bit about what this part of the country is known for, things like that. And that would allow me to kind of say, on the way here we passed through this place, this place, this place. So I could kind of include them. It's almost like a diary for me. It does mention every single place that I visited, but some of it is, as you say, very, very condensed into just one little line to say I passed through these places. But yeah, there was so much. And comics is just a medium where it takes a long time to kind of say things. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I just realized I was going to have to be quite careful about what I chose to focus on and what I would have to kind of condense down into just something in passing.
You know, you mentioned your writing is somewhat like a diary. You know, we know in the book that you kept a sketchbook, and you mentioned one or two times that Richard kept a diary. Did you keep a diary in addition to a sketchbook?
I did, yes. Yeah, I ended up with three notebooks, I think, by
Oh,
the end of the
wow.
trip, where, yeah, we pretty much, because traveling like we were doing, where we were kind of, there was a lot of, it was over a long period, 9 months total, 6 months in Mexico. There was a lot of waiting around in places. There's a lot of killing time. So,
So you had the time to write.
yeah, absolutely. And also when you're on a tiny budget and you're really trying to save money, you know, if you spend an evening sitting writing instead of, you know, spending money doing something, that's a great way for you to not burn through your budget. But also, yeah, I'm so glad that we did, because there's a lot that I would not have remembered by this point if I hadn't.
You know, you mentioned a second ago that in deciding what to include in Follow Me In, you definitely wanted to hit, you know, those locations, those events that were biggies for you guys. I want to come back to, I guess, the opening or semi-opening scene of the book, and that is the Day of the Dead. And I know that in Follow Me In, you mentioned a couple of times that this was really important for Richard, right? That he was really interested in indigenous cultures and customs, and the Day of the Dead was a big part of this. So I'm wondering how the Day of the Dead, how significant was that experience for both of you, but also you as an artist creating Follow Me In?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing to talk about, because I was a little wary of starting the story there, because Day of the Dead is almost a sort of cliche association of Mexico, where, you know, anytime Mexico has something in, you know, popular culture, like that movie, is it called Coco, animated film, that's kind of set around Day of the Dead. I think sometimes Mexican people get a little annoyed that that's the only thing that people outside of Mexico know about them. And I didn't want that to be a cliche to kind of start it with that. But at the same time, that was, to me, that was a really dramatic moment of me struggling. That would illustrate the struggle that was then going to become a theme of the book that I was having with Richard. And also the fact that that was, as you say, something that he had been really particularly interested to see, and yet he was drunk throughout and didn't really remember much. And so it allowed me to introduce that. And also I made sure with the way I drew it that I would draw it not in those visual cliches that you see everywhere. I would try and keep it quite real, because I think a lot of the stuff you see in popular culture about the Day of the Dead is very stylized, and I just wanted to draw it the way we saw it. But it also allowed me to tackle the topic of, you know, the problematic thing about being a tourist in another country, because we talk about how, you know, tourism with the Day of the Dead has had a huge impact on some of those small towns in that area. There's a huge influx of foreign tourists who come to see the festivities, and how that can be, you know, detrimental. And that is a topic I wanted to talk about. I didn't want to talk about traveling in Mexico without addressing the fact that there are problematic aspects to visiting these parts of the world. So that gave me a way to talk about that as well. And I hope that theme kind of pops up a few times. That idea of, I don't know, it certainly makes you think about your position in the world when you're able to sort of travel for 9 months without, you know, on your savings, and you're meeting local people who've never left their small town because, you know, they couldn't afford to go anywhere. So yeah, I did want some of that to come in as well. And the Day of the Dead was a way to talk about the effects of tourism.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that struck me about Follow Me In is every now and again, I mean, you don't keep coming back to it constantly, but every now and again it pops up, especially, you're right, with the Day of the Dead scene, where you become specifically aware of yourself as a tourist and what that might mean. And the responsibility or the relationship of the tourist to the local culture and the differences.
Yeah.
between the two of you.
Yeah, and you can certainly become aware sometimes that you're resented as a rich tourist, and that's kind of an uncomfortable feeling. But I think it's a valuable thing to experience and to be made to think about. Yeah, I did want that to be a part of the book as well.
Yeah. And speaking about Day of the Dead, we should mention that the cover of Follow Me In is a Day of the Dead reference where I guess you're in a jungle setting and you're looking behind you and there is a Day of the Dead skeleton?
Yeah, that's a character called Catrina, which I wanted to bring that in because that's my name as well. It's spelled a bit differently, but she's a character in popular culture. She was created by a cartoonist. I'm bad on dates, but like quite an old. Oh God, I feel bad now that I don't know the kind of period that this was. But yeah, a very old cartoonist who created her character as a kind of representation of those people in Mexico who harken back to the kind of Spanish heritage and hold that up as something to be revered, and kind of in contrast to the kind of local indigenous culture, which is something to be ashamed of to these people. So because she's kind of fancy and wears these big hats, flouncy hats with feathers and things, she's kind of a mockery of that whole idea of cultural identity in Mexico, where, your colonial sort of history, the people, the Spanish aspect of your kind of identity is the good part, or the part that you would, I don't know. Oh God, I don't know how to put this. But yeah, that's kind of interesting in Mexico's history that the majority of the population are mixed Spanish and indigenous, and there's a lot of kind of tension there.
So the character is La Catrina.
It is, yes. Yeah.
Now, I'm not recalling, but I mean, do you reference La Catrina in the text itself? Yeah,
there is a bit at the start where I buy a little statue of her on the street.
The one that you drop.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's right.
Which, that was a real thing that happened. And yeah, so yeah, I do very briefly have a character explain what she kind of represents at the start of the book. But yeah, I thought that was interesting because her character is all about those kind of issues as well. So I was kind of interested to have her on the cover. But again, I wanted to do it in a way that wasn't too much of a cliche.
Now, one of the things that becomes clear in Follow Me In is that when you and Richard were preparing for your trip, and even while you were, on your journey, you read and carried around with you various books about Mexican history, Mexican culture, guides on various regions of Mexico. But I'm wondering, you as an artist, preparing to write Follow Me In, or maybe even in the midst of Follow Me In, were there any comics narratives dealing with Mexico that you read as not necessarily as a way of preparing your own work of Follow Me In, but just to see how others are writing about Mexico and the Mexican experience? Yeah,
I did read travel-based comics initially to kind of see what people were doing, but I actually deliberately avoided anything that was about Mexico because I didn't want to sort of worry myself too much by comparing myself to what someone else was doing. And at the same time I started working on this, I think Peter Cooper's Ruins came out, which was very high.
Yeah.
That gave me a moment of panic where I thought, oh God, this is a very highly acclaimed book about Mexico, but I didn't want to read it because I didn't want to kind of start second guessing my own project. So I kind of left it alone. I'd love to read that now that my book's out.
Because I was wondering if you read it after the fact.
No, I do. I intend to. And there's another one, I think, La Perdida.
Yes.
I can't think who that's by, and I'd really like to read that too. I mean, Ricky and I did talk about the fact that these books were out there, but I think both of them seem different enough to what I ended up doing. And Ricky reassured me that they were because he'd read them.
Yeah, I have to say that when I was reading Follow Me In, I couldn't help but I didn't think of Ruins. That's a good one. I had forgotten about that. It's been a long time since I read that. And I think we even had Peter on the show when that came out, if I'm not mistaken, 3 years ago. but I couldn't help but think of Jessica Abel's La Perdida. And you're right. It's a very different book from Follow Me In. If for no other reason, it's not a travelogue. Where there is some potential crossover, and if you eventually read La Perdida, and I highly recommend it, you'll see what I'm talking about. There is a little bit of similarity in that the main character in La Perdida moves down to Mexico City and becomes very almost self-aware, self-conscious about the fact that she's an outsider. And also she's reminded by a couple of the locals that she ends up hanging out with that she definitely is an outsider, that she's not kind of like a tourist in many ways. And so there's that kind of awareness. And so her relationship as an American to the local culture is complicated, and it's somewhat similar to some of the things that you've just mentioned, you know, your own experience feeling a tourist.
Yeah. No, I definitely want to read that. That sounds really interesting.
But again, it's not a travelogue. I mean, she basically goes down to Mexico City and anchors herself there, and that's where the experiences take place. You know, you're all over the place.
Yes. Yeah, I'll have to go back to and listen to your interview with Peter as well.
Yeah, that was a fun interview. You know, you mentioned at the top of the show when I was asking you about your preference for autobiography and your potential interests in fiction that, you know, you have this idea for a new project. But now that Follow Me In is out, I'm wondering what you may be working on now. Any other projects?
I've done little odds and ends, but that's the idea that I mentioned at the start is the thing that I'm starting to work on now. It's definitely like an idea that would be hopefully not as long as this book, but it would be a substantial graphic novel, hopefully. And it's such early days that I don't really want to talk about it too much. But it's just when I sat down to write a sort of outline to start showing it to people to see whether they thought it was worth doing, it actually started to come together quite nicely. Whereas the years ago when I thought of it and I tried to do a little bit of work on it, I didn't know what I was doing. This time it all seemed to sort of fall into place, and that gave me some confidence to think, oh, this might work. But yeah, it's very different writing fiction, and it's definitely a bit more of a challenge for me. And I did kind of think, well, I can probably do lots more travel-based stuff, and that would be quite easy. But definitely because I really, really want to try something fictional, it seems like the time to try and tackle it.
Getting out of your comfort zone, as you put it.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, what about another issue of Cat Scene? You've got 8 out. Is there going to be a 9th?
Yeah, I'm still not sure about that. It's tricky to know how. I don't know. Like I started to sell less and less of each subsequent issue of that, and that was partly because I was starting to work on the book and I wasn't, spending much time promoting that project. I just did the issues because I had committed to do 8 on a schedule, and I do really enjoy doing them. But the fact that I wasn't selling as many of the later ones makes me think that it's maybe not the best idea to go back to it. I don't know. I think you always have to assess whether what you're doing is sustainable or whether it's the right thing to be spending your time on. So I'm not sure at this point if I'll do another one.
Yeah, that's interesting because, with Follow Me In, I mean, obviously you have Avery Hill behind it, right? So, in terms of getting the word out, in terms of marketing, you have a publishing house behind you. But with your own self-published stuff like Cat Scene, I mean, how do you spread the word? How do you sell copies? How do you get people interested?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to, if you're self-publishing, you have to do everything that a publishing house would do for you, which is, well, a good publishing house does for you, which is try and, get it in front of as many people as possible. And when it's just you and you also want to be making new work, it's hard to devote the time to kind of publicizing your work maybe as much as you should.
Well, how did you publicize Cat Scene? How did you get people interested? How did you get them aware that it actually existed?
I've always done a little bit of social media, and I did send it off to different reviewers and things.
Like us.
But like you, like yourself, yeah. But yeah, that all takes time, and yeah, sometimes you don't know whether to, how to divide up your time in between making new work. I've got 2 part-time jobs, as I said. I want to make new work, and also that can lead, I think, people sometimes to make a book or a zine or a comic and then just not devote enough time to the marketing side of it. It's tricky. Some people are better at it than others, but I do a lot of I do shows throughout the year as well, where I take it and sell it. Like Thought Bubble is the biggest, one of the biggest kind of slightly indie leaning fairs in the UK, and I do that almost every year. I did Toronto that one time. I'd love to do one in America sometime, but yeah, for me it's mostly social media, online stuff, and going around fairs and just selling to people directly.
And we should mention that you have an Etsy page, and if people go to your website, Katrina Chapman, and that's KatrionAChapman.com. Katrina Chapman. It's not Katriona Chapman. It's Katrina Chapman.com. Yeah. There's a link to your Etsy shop. So let's say that someone reads Follow Me In, and they're bowled over by it, and they go, hey, I want to find out more about what this cat chick is doing. They can go to your Etsy page, and you have back issues of Catzine. And I think all of them are available, right? 1 through 8?
Yeah, number 1 is almost sold out now. So if you're interested in seeing that,
get it while it's hot.
Soon. But yeah, I also sell bundles of 2 and 4 issues that at a discount. So if you don't have any and you're interested in getting 4 at once, you'll get 20% off or whatever. So you can also tell me in the comments when you make the order which issues you'd like to get, and I write a tiny bit about what's in each issue underneath the item listing. So yeah, they're all available online, but 1 is running very low.
Okay. So a great way for people to learn more about your work is through your website and your Etsy page. But they can definitely get a copy of your new book, Follow Me In, which came out last month from Avery Hill. Kat, I want to thank you again for coming on the Comics Alternative and talking with me about this new work as well as your art in general.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to thank Katrina Chapman once again for taking the time to talk with me for the podcast. Her new book, Follow Me In, was just released last month from Avery Hill Publishing. And if you're not familiar with Kat's work, this is a wonderful place to start. And if you want to find great books like Follow Me In at wonderful discounts, then definitely check out the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to dcbservice.com, and there, every month, you're going to find some mind-blowing specials, great discounts that you can't beat. That's dcbservice.com. And after you do get your titles there, get in touch with me and let me know what you thought about my interview with Katrina Chapman. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you could leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way by picking up your phone and dialing 4153-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can also reach us via social media. We're all over the place. We have accounts on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, Slack, and Discord. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcasts. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on Google Podcasts, on TuneIn, and on iHeartRadio and Spotify. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com. We have more shows and more interviews lined up in the days to come, so be sure to check back for those. Until then, take care.